Karoline Leavitt froze mid-step as a frail voice cut through the clamor of Manhattan's streets, trembling with desperation. "Please! Can you spare $1?" The words hit her like a punch, stirring something deep within her, a raw, protective instinct that made her think of her own son, Robert. She turned her head toward the sound, her heart already racing with the weight of what she might find. That morning, Karoline had attended a modest charity event in downtown Manhattan, the kind she'd always envisioned herself spearheading one day. For years, she'd dreamed of launching initiatives to help homeless children, but her life's demands had kept those dreams just out of reach. The stories shared there of children without homes or families, barely surviving on society's fringes, struck her deeply. She sat among the audience, hands gripped together in her lap, an all-too-familiar pang tightening her chest. For her, helping others wasn't merely a passion, it felt like a purpose etched into her core. Yet, as the event wrapped up and she stepped back into the bustling world, a heavier burden settled on her shoulders. The position she held came with immense responsibility, one that offered opportunities but also demanded perfection. Every choice, every step, seemed to be weighed and measured by invisible eyes. The pressure to embody an ideal, flawless, composed, unassailable, clawed at her as she walked, her navy jacket pulled tight against the sharp autumn chill, hands buried in her pockets to ward off the cold. Manhattan buzzed around her like a living thing, its energy relentless. Taxis honked in a chaotic rhythm, pedestrians shoved past with hurried steps, and somewhere nearby, a street performer strummed a guitar, the notes swallowed by the city's noise. Karoline kept her head down, trying to clear her mind. She wasn't just walking to escape the weight of her thoughts. She was searching for something, though she couldn't quite name it. Maybe it was clarity, or purpose, or just a moment to breathe without feeling the world's eyes on her. She thought of Robert, her little boy, safe and warm at home, his laughter a constant in her life. The image of him steadied her, but it also sharpened the ache she felt for kids who didn't have that security. Her thoughts were interrupted when she collided with a man rounding the corner too fast. "Watch where you're going, lady," he barked, his voice sharp enough to slice through the din. He was middle-aged, dressed in a wrinkled suit, his face flushed with irritation. A briefcase swung wildly in his hand as he gestured at her, as if she'd personally ruined his day. Karoline stumbled back, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. I'm sorry," she stammered, but he wasn't listening. "People like you think you own the damn sidewalk," he muttered, loud enough for her to hear, before storming off into the crowd. The words cut deeper than she expected, stirring a familiar self-doubt she couldn't shake. She stood there for a moment, rooted to the spot, her heart pounding. She wanted to yell back, to defend herself, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she felt small, inadequate, like she'd failed some unspoken test. The encounter left her rattled, her confidence shaken. Why couldn't she stand up for herself? Why did she always feel like she had to prove something? Karoline shook her head, trying to push the moment aside. She wasn't here to pick fights with strangers. She adjusted her jacket and kept walking, her thoughts drifting back to the charity event. The stories of those kids lingered in her mind. Children who'd been abandoned, forgotten, left to fend for themselves in a city that didn't care. She'd always wanted to do more than just listen or donate money. She wanted to roll up her sleeves and help in ways that mattered. But the weight of her own life, the expectations, the scrutiny, made it feel like her hands were tied. How could she change the world when she could barely navigate a confrontation with a rude stranger? Her internal struggle churned as she moved through the streets, the city's pulse a constant reminder of the chaos around her. She didn't notice how far she'd walked until that faint, desperate voice stopped her in her tracks. "Please, can you spare $1?" Karoline's breath caught. She turned toward the sound, her eyes scanning the sidewalk until they landed on a small figure huddled against a building. A boy, no older than 10, sat there with a crumpled cardboard sign propped beside him. The words on it, "Hungry and alone, please help," hit her like a wave, pulling her out of her own head and into his reality. Karoline crouched down to the boy's level, taking in his appearance. His clothes were threadbare, a faded jacket hanging loosely on his bony shoulders, jeans torn at the knees. His face was pale, almost ghostly, with dark circles underscoring his hollow brown eyes that looked like they'd forgotten what hope felt like. A tattered backpack sat next to him, its zipper broken, a few meager belongings spilling out. "What's your name?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The boy hesitated, his gaze darting nervously around before settling on her. "Robert," he mumbled, his voice so quiet she almost missed it. The name hit her like a jolt of electricity. Robert. Same as her son. Her little Robert, who was probably at home right now, safe and warm, giggling over some silly game. The coincidence stirred something deep within her, a fierce protective instinct she couldn't ignore. She swallowed hard, forcing a gentle smile. "Hi, Robert. I'm Karoline. How long have you been out here?" He shrugged, his small fingers clutching the straps of his backpack. "Dunno. A while." His words were clipped, guarded, like he'd learned not to trust too easily. Karoline nodded, trying to keep her tone steady despite the ache in her chest. "Are you alone? Where's your family?" At that, Robert's face darkened, his eyes dropping to the ground. He didn't answer right away, his silence heavy with unspoken pain. She waited, giving him space until he finally spoke, his voice barely audible. "My dad, he died. Work accident. And my mom—" His voice cracked, trailing off. "It's okay," Karoline said gently. "You don't have to tell me everything right now." But Robert shook his head, as if the words had been bottled up too long. "Her name's Sarah. She said she'd come back, but she didn't." The confession came out haltingly, each word heavy with the weight of betrayal. Karoline's stomach twisted, abandoned. The word echoed in her mind, sharp and unforgiving. She thought of her own Robert again, the way his small hand felt in hers, the way he looked at her like she could fix anything. The idea of him out here, alone like this boy, made her feel sick. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "That's not right. You shouldn't have to go through this." Before Robert could respond, a loud scoff broke through the moment. A group of 3 young guys, maybe in their early 20s, had stopped nearby, their smirks cutting like knives. One of them, a lanky kid with a backwards cap, kicked at Robert's sign, sending it skidding across the pavement. "Oh, look, another sob story," he sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. "What's next, kid? Gonna say you're an orphan prince or some crap?" Robert flinched, his small body curling in on itself as tears welled in his eyes. The sight snapped something in Karoline. She stood up, her hands clenched into fists. "Hey, back off," she said sharply, stepping between Robert and the group. "He's just a kid. What's your problem?" The lanky guy laughed, exchanging a glance with his buddies. "Ah, great. Here comes the hero. What are you, some rich chick looking for a feel-good moment? Bet you'll post this on social media later. Saved a poor kid today." His tone was biting, each word laced with disdain. His friend, a stockier guy with a buzz cut, chimed in. "Yeah, lady, don't pretend you care. You'll walk away in 5 minutes and forget he exists." Karoline's face burned, anger and shame warring inside her. She wanted to scream that they were wrong, that she wasn't like that, but their words struck a nerve. Was she really helping, or was this just some fleeting impulse? Still, she couldn't back down, not with Robert trembling behind her. "I'm not walking away," she shot back, her voice shaking but firm. "And you don't get to bully a kid who's already been through enough, so why don't you keep moving?" The lanky guy took a step closer, his sneer widening. "Or what? You gonna call your fancy friends to come save the day? Look at you. Probably never struggled a day in your life. You don't belong down here with the rest of us." His words stung, hitting every insecurity she'd been wrestling with all day. She felt small under his glare, but the sound of Robert's quiet sobs behind her kept her grounded. She wouldn't let them win. "Just leave us alone," she said, her voice steadier now, though her heart was pounding. The group lingered for a moment longer, muttering insults under their breath before finally sauntering off, their laughter fading into the city noise. Karoline exhaled shakily, turning back to Robert. He was wiping his eyes with his sleeve, his face a mask of humiliation and fear. "I'm sorry about that," she said, crouching down again. "They're wrong, you know. You don't deserve any of this." Robert didn't meet her eyes, his voice barely audible. "Nobody cares, they never do." His eyes flickered with a guarded look, as if he'd heard promises like hers before, promises that turned to dust. The words cut deeper than anything the group had thrown at her. She reached into her pocket, pulling out a $20 bill and pressing it into his hand. "I care," she said firmly, "and I'm gonna help you, okay? I promise." But Robert just stared at the money, his expression unchanged. "Sure," he muttered, the skepticism in his tone like a slap. "That's what they all say." Karoline's heart sank. She wanted to argue, to convince him she meant it, but the doubt in his eyes mirrored her own fears. Maybe she wasn't equipped for this. Maybe she'd fail him, like everyone else had. Still, the name Robert echoed in her mind, tying her to this boy in a way she couldn't shake. She thought of her son, of the life she'd built for him, and the contrast made her stomach churn. No kid deserved this, least of all one who shared her boy's name. She wasn't walking away, no matter how hard it got. Karoline knew she couldn't leave Robert on the street, not after hearing his story and seeing the despair in his eyes. The name Robert, the same as her son's, burned in her mind, fueling a resolve she couldn't ignore. She pulled out her phone and dialed Emily, a friend who worked with a local social services organization. "I need your help," she said, her voice urgent. "There's a boy here, Robert. He's been abandoned. We need to find his mom and get him somewhere safe." Emily promised to come as soon as she could, but the wait felt agonizing. Karoline sat down beside Robert on the cold pavement, trying to coax more out of him while they waited. "Tell me more about your mom," she said gently, hoping to build some trust. Robert's eyes flickered with a mix of longing and pain, but he hesitated as if afraid to let the words out. After a long pause, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Her name's Sarah. She used to be real nice, read me stories every night, fairy tales mostly. But after Dad died, she changed. Started acting weird, yelling a lot, then leaving me alone for days. Said she was going to protect me by going away, but she just left me here." Karoline's chest tightened. She imagined her own Robert in this boy's place, abandoned and scared, and the thought made her feel sick. "That must have been so hard," she said softly. "I can't imagine what you've been through. But I'm here now, okay? We'll figure this out." Robert just shrugged, his gaze fixed on the ground. The doubt in his posture gnawed at her. She wanted to help, but she didn't know where to start, and his lack of faith in her only deepened her own insecurities. Their conversation was cut short when a shadow loomed over them. A burly security guard in a cheap uniform stood there, his arms crossed and a scowl etched on his face. "You need to move along," he barked, his tone dripping with disdain. "We don't allow loitering here, makes the area look trashy." Karoline's jaw dropped, indignation flaring inside her. She stood up, facing him squarely. "He's a kid," she snapped. "He's got nowhere else to go. How can you just stand there and act like he's the problem?" The guard's eyes narrowed, his voice rising. "Don't give me that bleeding heart crap, lady. I got a job to do. This ain't a shelter, it's private property. You think you're some kind of savior? Take your charity case somewhere else before I call the cops." His words hit like a slap, each one laced with contempt. Karoline's hands shook with anger, but she refused to back down. "You'd really call the police on a 10-year-old boy? What kind of person does that make you?" She shot back, her voice trembling with fury. "Someone who don't care for freeloaders dirtying up the place," he sneered, stepping closer. "You got 5 minutes to get lost, or I'm making that call. Your choice." Karoline clenched her fists, torn between wanting to scream and knowing she couldn't risk escalating things further. Emily still hadn't arrived, and getting arrested wouldn't help Robert. "Fine," she spat, glaring at him. "But this isn't over." She turned to Robert, her voice softening. "Come on, let's go." He scrambled to his feet, clutching his backpack as they moved. A few blocks away, the guard's cold stare boring into their backs. When Emily finally arrived, her expression was a mix of concern and determination. She knelt beside Robert, introducing herself with a warm smile, but Karoline could see the boy was already withdrawing, his shoulders hunched and eyes distant. They decided to take him to a temporary shelter Emily knew about, a small, overcrowded facility a few miles away. The place reeked of stale food and unwashed bodies, its walls lined with cots crammed so close there was barely room to walk. Robert's face fell as they stepped inside, and Karoline's guilt surged. This wasn't the safety she'd hoped to give him. "It's just for now," she reassured him, though the words felt hollow. Leaving Robert in that cramped shelter felt like a betrayal, but she had to find Sarah. She owed him that much. He didn't respond, retreating into silence as he sat on a rickety cot, staring at the floor. Karoline stayed with him for a while, but her mind raced with what came next. Finding Sarah was the priority. She couldn't let Robert grow up in a place like this. Hours later, Emily called with news. They'd tracked Sarah down to a rundown motel on the outskirts of Manhattan. Karoline left Robert in Emily's care and made her way to the address, her stomach knotting with both hope and dread. When she knocked on the door, a woman answered, her appearance a stark contrast to the loving mother Robert had described. Sarah's eyes were sunken, her hair a tangled mess, and her voice rasped with suspicion. "Who the hell are you?" she demanded, gripping the doorframe. "I'm Karoline. I found your son Robert. He's safe, but he needs you." "I'm here to help," Karoline said, trying to keep her tone calm. Sarah's face twisted into a sneer, her eyes flashing with bitterness. She'd heard empty promises from strangers before, each one leaving her more broken than the last. "Help? Don't give me that crap. What's this, some kind of publicity stunt? You look like one of them rich types who thinks they can fix everybody's problems." Her words were venomous, each one a jab at Karoline's intentions. "I'm not here for fame," Karoline shot back, her voice rising despite her efforts to stay composed. "Your son's been on the streets, alone, because you left him. He deserves better than that." Sarah slammed her hand against the door, her voice cracking. "Don't you dare tell me what my son deserves. You don't know me. You don't know what I've been through. I left 'cause I had to, 'cause I'm no good for him. You think you can just waltz in and judge me?" Karoline's frustration boiled over, her voice trembling with emotion. "I'm not judging you. I'm trying to help you. Robert loves you. He's been waiting for you. Doesn't that mean anything?" Sarah shouted, "Get out! I don't need your pity, and I sure as hell don't need you playing hero for my kid. Go back to your perfect life and leave us alone." The door slammed shut in Karoline's face, the sound echoing like a gunshot. She stood there stunned, her breath coming in shaky gasps. The rejection stung deeply, but the name Robert reverberated in her mind, tethering her to the fight. She thought of her own son, safe at home, and the contrast only strengthened her resolve. Sarah might hate her, but Karoline wasn't giving up. Not on her, and definitely not on Robert. Karoline stood outside the motel door, her heart pounding as she clutched the crumpled piece of paper in her hand. She hadn't slept much the night before, replaying Sarah's harsh words in her mind. The rejection stung, but giving up wasn't an option, not when Robert's future hung in the balance. The letter in her hand was a last-ditch effort, written by Robert himself at the shelter. His shaky handwriting poured out his longing for his mother, his hope that she'd come back for him. Karoline knocked on the door again, bracing herself for another fight. The door creaked open, revealing Sarah's haggard face. Her eyes were bloodshot, her expression a mix of suspicion and exhaustion. "You again?" she snapped, her voice rough. "Told you to leave me alone. What part of that didn't you get?" Karoline held up the letter, her voice steady despite the tension. "I'm not here to argue, Sarah. This is from Robert. He wrote it for you. Just read it, please." Sarah's gaze flickered to the paper, but her face hardened. "I don't want to see it," she said, her tone sharp as she snatched the letter from Karoline's hand and threw it to the floor. "You think a piece of paper's going to fix anything? I'm no good for him. All I've done is hurt him. Don't you get that?" Her voice cracked, rising into a shout. "I don't deserve to be his mom." Karoline's heart sank, but she didn't back down. She stepped inside, ignoring Sarah's glare, and knelt to pick up the letter. "You're wrong," she said firmly, holding it out again. "Robert's been out there on the streets, alone, scared out of his mind. He's gone hungry, been mocked, had to sleep on the cold ground, and through all of that he's still waiting for you. He still loves you. Doesn't that mean anything?" Sarah's hands trembled as she stared at the letter, her face a battlefield of emotions. Anger, guilt, despair. "You don't understand," she muttered, her voice breaking. "I'm a mess. I can't even take care of myself. He's better off without me." But Karoline shook her head, her own voice softening. "I know what it's like to feel like you're failing the people you love most. I've got a son named Robert too. If I ever thought he was out there suffering like your boy is, I'd do anything to fix it. You can still fix this, Sarah. It's not too late." The mention of her own son seemed to pierce through Sarah's defenses. She froze, her eyes meeting Karoline's for the first time without hostility. Slowly she took the letter, her fingers shaking as she unfolded it. Her lips moved silently as she read Robert's words. "Mom, I miss you so much. I don't care what happened. I just want you to come back. I love you." Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over as her breath hitched. She pressed a hand to her mouth, stifling a sob. "He shouldn't love me," she whispered, her voice raw with anguish. "Not after what I did." Karoline knelt beside her, her tone gentle but firm. "But he does, and that's worth fighting for. Let me help you get clean, Sarah. There's a program I can get you into. A good one. I'll make sure you and Robert have what you need to start over." Sarah looked up, her tear-streaked face a mix of hope and fear. For a long moment she said nothing, her gaze drifting back to the letter as if searching for the strength to believe in herself again. Finally she nodded slowly, her voice trembling. "Okay," she said quietly, "but you better not be playing me. I need to know you're for real, not just some do-gooder looking for a pat on the back." "I'm here for the long haul," Karoline assured her. "You'll see." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of Sarah's decision settling between them, but the quiet was shattered when the door burst open, revealing a wiry man with bloodshot eyes and a sneer on his face. He reeked of stale cigarette smoke, his clothes disheveled. "Well, damn, Sarah," he drawled, his voice dripping with mockery. "Didn't know you were cozying up with the charity squad now. What's this, your new babysitter?" Sarah tensed, her hands balling into fists. "Leave me alone, Mick," she snapped, but her voice wavered. Mick laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Oh, come on, don't tell me you're buying into this crap. She's just going to use you to feel good about herself, then ditch you when the going gets tough. You belong with us, out there where it's real." He stepped closer, his sneer turning predatory. "Or are you going to sell out for some fancy rehab scam?" Karoline stood up, placing herself between Mick and Sarah. "She's done with that life," she said, her voice steady despite the anger simmering inside her. "You need to leave, now." Mick's eyes narrowed, his tone turning venomous. "Who the hell you to tell me what to do? Think you're better than us 'cause you got money and a pretty face? You don't know nothing about what Sarah needs." "I know she deserves a chance," Karoline shot back, her voice rising. "And I know Robert deserves his mom back, not some lowlife dragging her down, so back off." Mick laughed coldly, stepping closer until he was inches from her face. "Big talk for a chick who's probably never been hungry a day in her life. You want to play hero? Try living in our world for a week. See how long you last before you run back to your cushy little bubble." Karoline's hands shook with fury, but she held her ground, thinking of her own Robert and the boy waiting for his mother. "I'm not running anywhere," she said, her voice low and fierce. "Sarah's made her choice. Respect it or get out." Mick glared at her for a long moment, then spat on the floor at her feet. "Fine," he muttered, turning to Sarah. "Don't come crying to me when this falls apart." He stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Sarah sat frozen, her breathing ragged. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly, her eyes still glistening with tears. For the first time she managed a small, shaky smile, her eyes softening as a flicker of hope broke through the walls she'd built. Karoline shook her head, her expression softening. "Yeah, I did. You're worth fighting for, and so is Robert." It wasn't much, but it was a start, a fragile promise of something better. After weeks of supporting Sarah through the rehab program, Karoline witnessed a transformation that felt nothing short of miraculous. Sarah's hollow eyes regained their spark, her gaunt frame filled out, and her laughter, once a distant memory, began to echo again. The love she'd buried beneath guilt and addiction resurfaced, directed wholly toward her son, Robert. Karoline had stayed involved every step of the way, checking in, arranging therapy sessions, and ensuring Sarah had the resources to rebuild her life. It wasn't easy, there were setbacks, moments of doubt, but Sarah's determination to be the mother Robert deserved never wavered. The day of their reunion arrived, set in a small park in Manhattan. Karoline stood back, her heart swelling as Sarah waited nervously on a bench, her hands twisting in her lap. When Robert arrived, clutching a social worker's hand, his eyes locked onto his mother. For a moment he hesitated, then broke into a run, throwing himself into Sarah's arms. "Mom!" he cried, his voice muffled against her shoulder. Robert's eyes lit up as he saw his mother's brighter smile, a stark contrast to the hollow shell he'd last known. Sarah sobbed openly, wrapping him in a fierce embrace. "I'm so sorry, baby," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm here now. I'll never leave you again." Robert clung to her, nodding through his own tears. "I missed you so much." Karoline watched, a lump in her throat, warmth spreading through her chest. The sight stirred memories of her own son, also named Robert, and the unconditional love she felt for him. She felt a quiet pride. She'd helped give this family a second chance. Determined to secure their fresh start, Karoline found them a modest apartment, a clean, cozy space with enough room for them to grow. She covered the first few months' rent, giving Sarah time to get on her feet. Sarah landed a job at a community center, helping others battling addiction, a role that gave her purpose, a way to turn her pain into something meaningful. Robert returned to school, his shy smile growing brighter each day as he made friends and rediscovered the joys of childhood, playing tag, reading adventure books, laughing without fear. Karoline stood in the same park weeks later, watching Robert chase a soccer ball, his laughter ringing out. Sarah sat nearby, cheering him on, her face lit with a contentment Karoline hadn't seen before. The scene filled Karoline with a deep satisfaction, a sense of growth she hadn't expected. She'd learned that true compassion wasn't about recognition, it was about the small, meaningful changes she could spark in someone's life. Thinking of her own Robert, she felt a swell of happiness, knowing he'd be proud of her for this. As she watched Robert play, she smiled softly, whispering a promise to herself. She'd start a new initiative for homeless kids, ensuring no child would face what Robert had. Kindness, she realized, could ripple far beyond a single act, and that was worth every struggle. Compassion isn't about grand gestures or recognition. It's about showing up, persisting through resistance, and believing in someone's potential even when they've lost faith in themselves. Sarah and Robert's story taught her that small acts of kindness can ignite monumental change, offering hope where despair once reigned. In life, this means we don't need to wait for the perfect moment or resources to help others. It's the willingness to listen, to fight for someone, that matters most. Each of us can be a lifeline, turning a stranger's darkest day into a new beginning. Thank you for joining me in this story. I hope it inspires you as much as it did me. What lessons did you take away? Share your thoughts below, and let's keep spreading kindness together. Hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of hope.